My name is Ashley Grace. I am 36 years old. I never expected to inherit $12 million and a sprawling old mansion in Louisiana from my estranged Uncle Leon. It was supposed to be the start of a new life. I even bought my husband, Thomas, an expensive motorcycle, hoping it would finally make him happy. But fate had other plans. On the drive home, a truck slammed into my car on the bridge. I spent 2 weeks in a coma. And when I finally opened my eyes, Thomas wasn't there. A month later, he suddenly appeared with his new wife. She screamed loudly when she saw me because... Before I tell you what happened next, let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more true family drama stories that will leave you speechless. My relationship with my Uncle Leon was complicated at best. He was an eccentric person, a collector of antique maps who wore linen shirts in winter and ran a small chain of Louisiana wineries like a man tending a garden. He was quite reserved, swore by paper ledgers, and labeled every bottle in looping fountain pen script. My uncle and my father had fallen out back in the 90s over money and pride, two stubborn men convinced the other had betrayed the family. After that, all holidays were divided. We sent polite cards through my mother, and the silence between houses grew thicker than summer air. As a child, I escaped that silence whenever I could. Visiting Leon in New Orleans felt like stepping through a secret passage. His shotgun house on Prytania always smelled of sweet grapes and old books, a scent that lived in the curtains and the floorboards. In the parlor, globes crowded side tables. In the hallway, maps climbed the walls, coastlines inked in sepia, trade winds sketched like delicate stitches. He'd lift me onto a creaky stool and trace the river with his finger. "Maps are promises, kiddo," he'd say. Someone walked there, drew, and believed. He let me tilt the old brass compass and taught me how to fold a chart so it wouldn't crack at the creases. We'd make gumbo that tasted faintly of smoke and stand on the porch watching thunderstorms sweep down St. Charles. He took me to the market for beignets, powdered sugar dusting our shirts while the streetcar rattled past. In the cellar, he kept barrels from his first harvest and a tin box filled with receipts from vineyards scattered along the Gulf. He let me stamp case labels, Ashley in crooked ink, and paid me in pralines wrapped in wax paper. When I was 9, he pressed a brittle map of the Mississippi Delta into my hands and said, "Solemn as a priest, guard what guides you." Then I got older. School, internships, a job that ate my weekends. The visits thinned. Dad's resentment grew louder every time Leon's name came up, and I learned to change the subject. Years passed in that awkward family truce where everyone pretends indifference is peace. A year before Leon died, the call came from his housekeeper, Ms. Pearl, a woman with rings that clicked when she folded linens. Her voice was gentle but unflinching. "Cancer, stage unclear, treatments beginning." I hung up in my car outside the grocery store and watched people push carts through sunlit steam from the produce misters. Something in me pivoted. I drove to New Orleans that Friday and almost every Friday after. The route became a ritual. Coffee at dawn, I-10 straight through, radio low. I brought soups and newspapers, fed the cat that despised everyone but him, and aired out the rooms when the medicinal smell settled too thickly. We made smaller meals, walked shorter blocks, and moved the map table closer to the window. He showed me how to read the winery books, columns of numbers in his tidy hand, and how to tell when a barrel was lying by the way it sounded when you tapped it. Sometimes he'd sleep while I dusted frames and rehung a warp chart so it wouldn't curl like a leaf. Illness reshaped our conversations. He told me how he bought the first vineyard with a handshake and a loan nobody thought he'd repay. He admitted he'd memorized the names of old river pilots and could recite them like prayers. When the pain pills made him loose-tongued, he'd talk about my father, 2 boys who once fished from the same dock, then men who couldn't find their way back. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask me to carry messages. He just said, "Pride is a map with no north." One evening, the house smelled like warm rain. I was refilling his water when he fixed me with that bright, mischievous look that always meant a truth was coming. "You're the only one who doesn't pretend for money," he said. I laughed, startled, and he shook his head. "Not a compliment, a fact. You sit with me whether I own 5 vineyards or 5 plants on the porch." I told him I came because of the maps and the gumbo and the thunder. He said I came because of love. We both let the subject rest there, a small flag planted between us. Late summer folded into fall. Some weekends were good, some were hospitals, plastic bracelets, and the metallic taste of air conditioning. Miss Pearl and I took turns keeping watch, counting pills into a blue organizer. He grew smaller, but no less himself, cracking jokes about nurses' shoes, debating which vintage could outlast a hurricane. The last time he went downstairs, he insisted on touching the barrel from his first harvest. Proof, he whispered, palm flat against the wood. I was here. When he died, the house felt like a stage after the audience leaves, acoustics intact, music gone. We held a simple funeral at a neighborhood church with fans that clicked and a choir that made even the sorrowful hymns sound like sails filling. Men from the wineries came in work shirts, palms stained purple at the edges. Miss Pearl chose his suit, and I tucked a printed copy of that Delta map into his pocket. My dad didn't come. He sent flowers that arrived late, lilies cool as porcelain, the card unsigned. The will was read a week later in a lawyer's office above a bakery. I sat between Ms. Pearl and a vineyard manager who kept twisting his cap. The attorney cleared his throat and named assets like a roll call. The house, the ancient map collection, controlling shares in the wineries, a scattering of investments I didn't recognize. I waited for the pivot toward distant cousins, toward institutions or trusts I'd never heard of. Instead, he read my name. Entire estate. Conditions about preserving certain archives, provisions for staff, donations Leon had outlined to local libraries, but the whole of it to me. The room tilted. I heard the traffic below, the whir of a mixer from the bakery, the attorney asking if I understood. I did not. Not really. I expected a keepsake, a letter, perhaps the compass and a file of stories. I did not expect ledgers and deeds and keys that weighed heavy in my palm. The words felt like someone else's life, and yet the smell of grapes and old books rose up in my memory, steadying me like a hand at my back. I signed the papers with the fountain pen they offered and thought of Leon's instruction to guard what guides you. With my husband Thomas, I met at a music festival in Austin in late spring, when the air smelled like sunscreen and the sound checks bled together in waves. Thomas was a charismatic drummer in a local band, all sweat and rhythm and a grin that felt like a dare. I was there with a press pass and a borrowed camera, filing pieces for the city desk about the New South by Energy, pretending my beat was music when it was really people. He handed me a bottle of water over the barricade and said I had reporter eyes, curious, a little tired, impossible to fool. The night ended with us sharing a paper boat of tacos under a street lamp, drums and laughter pulsing through the sidewalks like a second heartbeat. He dreamed of fame the way some people dream of escape, hungry, specific, impatient. He carried sticks in his back pocket, practiced rudiments on his thighs while we waited for coffee, tapped out odd-time signatures on the kitchen counter while I transcribed interviews. I had deadlines, a battered Honda, and a landlord who fixed leaks with duct tape. He had a rented kit, a room in a 4-person house where the couch smelled like stale beer, and a notebook full of set lists. It should have terrified me, but it felt like meeting someone who understood the tempo I kept in my head. The band played bars on Red River and crawfish boils on the east side. I wrote about zoning battles and school board meetings. We were both hustling toward a future nobody promised. The early years were a kind of duet. I supported us financially. He lived for his art. I picked up extra assignments, weekend features, late-night city council recaps, a Sunday column about neighborhood diners that paid just enough to keep the lights on. He carried gear up narrow stairwells and came home smelling like cymbal polish and cigarette fog. Our first apartment had a mattress on the floor, a second-hand table with one short leg, and a milk crate where he kept metronomes and drum keys like talismans. We ate eggs and rice when tips were thin, split the good coffee on Fridays, and celebrated small things, a byline above the fold, a slot opening for a touring band, the landlord promising, again, to look at the AC. I believed in him the way he said he believed in me, both of us improvising around the beat of a shared plan. We got married at the courthouse on a Tuesday because it cost less and we could both take lunch. After, we ate pie at a diner with sticky menus and took photos in a strip mall booth where his drumsticks photobombed our kiss. I wore a white dress I found on sale. He wore a black shirt with fraying cuffs and the wild joy of someone who thinks love will steady every shaky stage. We signed the lease on a slightly better place with a tiny balcony and a neighbor who practiced trumpet every morning at 8. I didn't mind. Morning brass felt like luck. Then the club stopped booking him. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow thinning of invitations, a promoter who stopped returning texts, a new crop of younger bands that drew bigger crowds for less pay. It's the algorithm, Thomas would say, as if the internet itself was sabotaging the drums. The band lost their Thursday residency. The bar switched to DJ nights and experiences. Rent went up. Our landlord's promises kept breaking like cheap strings. I got a second freelance gig editing copy for a travel site that wanted authentic voices and paid in net 45 checks. The bills stacked like narrow bricks, and the space between us began to feel like an alley where wind collects. He started disappearing at night, claiming he was rehearsing. Sometimes he left after dinner, sometimes he left before we ate, grabbed his sticks and a hoodie and the aura of someone needed elsewhere. I told myself this was what commitment looked like, that art required hours no one saw. I told myself a lot of things, that the notifications lighting his screen at 2 a.m. were band chats, that the glitter on his cuffs came from a stage, that the smell of strangers' perfume was part of the scene. When I asked simple questions, where, with whom, how late, he'd kiss my forehead like I was a child and say, "Don't worry. I've got this." I kept count in quiet ways, receipts in his jeans, the number of nights my dinner congealed on the stove, the miles I put on the Honda covering stories nobody read past the second paragraph. I learned how to stretch chicken into 3 meals and how to sleep with one ear open for the sound of the key in the lock. Some mornings he was tender and apologetic, dropping a coffee on my desk with sugar mixed right, hands gentle on my shoulders as if to smooth the worry away. Other mornings, he was a storm you could feel coming by the pressure drop in the room. When I asked about money, he turned brittle. I'd set the electric bill on the table with my notes and say we needed a plan, that I couldn't carry both timelines forever. He'd pace, drumsticks clicking against his palm, eyes bright with the righteousness of the misunderstood. "You don't understand my soul," he'd yell, voice bouncing off our cheap walls. The first time he said it, I laughed. It sounded like a pretentious lyric. The third time, I stopped laughing. He began to use it like a shield, a way to turn our life into an insult against his art. If I mentioned debt, it became an attack on his purpose. If I mentioned rent, it became proof I was small-minded. If I asked him to pick up a shift anywhere, it became betrayal. We tried to course correct, at least that's what I called it, a little experiments to keep us steady. He taught a kids' drum clinic on Saturdays for a while and came home lit up by the way a 9-year-old found the downbeat. I rearranged our budget, canceled the streaming service, sold a camera lens. He promised to do session work for a studio on South Lamar, then bailed because the producer didn't get him. The band tried a new sound, bought a fog machine, paid for a publicist who delivered a single blog mention that read like a typo. Hope became a currency of its own, expensive, unsustainable, necessary. Our fights got quieter and colder. He'd come home late, peel off his hoodie, drop sticks into the sink like spoons. I'd close my laptop, the cursor blinking on a half-written lead about a zoning variance, and ask how rehearsal went. "Fine. Did you get paid?" Exposure. How much exposure pays for groceries? You always twist it. I learned all the shapes our silence could take. The one where we pretended to sleep, the one where we clattered pots a little too loud, the one where I wrote until my fingers hurt and he tapped paradiddles on the arm of the couch as if the rhythm itself could argue on his behalf. I began to notice small cruelties. The way he'd roll his eyes when I mentioned a colleague's promotion. The way he'd say your little stories about pieces I'd stayed up all night perfecting. The way he'd use my steady job as a safety net and then resent the net for existing. Love, it turns out, can be generous to the point of self-erasure. I kept making him plates, kept writing him notes, kept buying drum heads on sale with my grocery card because the sound of him practicing meant he hadn't given up. I didn't want to be the person who asked him to quit the thing that made him him. By the time our third anniversary arrived, the band was mostly history, shrunk to group texts and a storage unit where amps went to sleep. Thomas still introduced himself as a drummer, but the stages were mostly living rooms now, the audience's friends who clapped out of habit. I planned a small dinner at home, roast chicken, the good wine I'd been saving, a cake from the bakery with the soft frosting he liked. He was late. When he finally walked in, I saw he'd forgotten. The candle had puddled wax on the tablecloth. He hugged me, distracted, and said he had to run out just for a bit because someone needed him. I watched him choose a night that was supposed to be ours, watched him pick up his sticks and his phone and his vanishing point. It wasn't one thing that broke us, it was the erosion. He said art required sacrifice. And I started to understand he meant mine. On the day the lawyer told me about the inheritance, the world felt unreal, like the air itself had been carbonated. I floated down the courthouse steps in New Orleans with a folder under my arm and a buzzing in my head that sounded like 1,000 honeybees chanting possibility. $12 million. A mansion that once lived in my childhood like a bedtime story. I stopped for an iced coffee I didn't need and a paper bag of beignets, then texted Thomas a photo of the sugar-dusted mess and a line that read, "Everything's about to get easier." He didn't answer, but I told myself he was asleep after a late rehearsal. I told myself a lot of things. Driving west toward home, I planned out loud because saying it made it feel less like a dream. Pay off the debts. Fix the Honda or retire it and buy something with airbags that didn't sigh at me. Refinish the floors in Leon's mansion, one room at a time. Hire a physical therapist for my mother's knees, start a small scholarship for girls who liked maps, finally take a real vacation. I thought of Thomas and the way his eyes used to light when he talked about touring. Maybe we'd turn the carriage house into a studio, soundproofed properly, with new heads and cables that worked on the first try. Maybe the motorcycle he'd been scrolling on his phone at 2 a.m., the one he said would make him feel like himself again. Why not? I pictured the box with the keys, imagined the look on his face when I placed it in his hands like a truce. The sun was bright and clean. Traffic thin to a ribbon. I couldn't stop smiling. I rolled the window down and let the river wind up into the car, that damp scent of silt and summer. By the time I reached the bridge over the Mississippi, my mental list had stretched to next year and back. I set the phone in the console, turned the radio lower, and eased into the center lane, the guardrails flashing in steady rhythm. It happened fast and in fragments. A truck in my peripheral vision drifted, then jerked, then came at me like a door slamming open. White cab, dull red trailer, a smear of lettering I couldn't read. The lane line vanished under the tires. There was no horn, only the guttural roar of diesel, the sudden sickening angle of grille, the world tipping into noise. I gripped the wheel. The folder slid. The paper bag burst and flung sugar like snow. My purse pitched off the seat, and the small black box with the motorcycle keys shot out, a dark bird arcing across the car. For a moment it hung there, impossible and weightless, and then everything shattered, glass, sound, time. I remember the taste of copper, the smell of hot rubber, a thunder that didn't stop. I remember thinking stupidly about how I hadn't called my mother back, and how I hadn't bought milk, and how the river below seemed too calm for what was happening above it. I tried to steer. I tried to breathe. The truck pushed and then released, and my car spun, the guardrail sparking like a fuse. The last thing I saw was the key box hitting the passenger window and bursting open, a tiny chrome fob flashing once, like a signal flare. Then black. 14 days disappeared into a sealed envelope I can't open. When I surfaced, the world was fluorescent and slow. The ceiling tiles counted themselves. Machines hummed a sleepy chorus. My mouth felt full of pennies and cotton. There was a plastic taste at the back of my throat and an ache lodged under everything, dull and convinced. A nurse noticed my eyes and called my name like she'd been waiting to use it. "Ashley? Can you hear me?" I blinked. She squeezed my hand and anchored me to the bed. Broken bones, they told me gently. A fractured clavicle, 2 ribs that would complain with every breath for a while, a small break in my left wrist that made my fingers feel like strangers. Deep bruises across my hips and chest from the seatbelt that saved me. Cuts stitched neat and tidy along my hairline and cheekbone, a latticework of purple that would turn yellow and then fade. A long road to recovery. The phrase sounded like something they printed on pamphlets, but it was true. Time slowed into routines, vitals, meds, a sip of broth, a looped parade of commercials on a TV hung too high. Days thickened. The light came and went, nurses rotated like constellations, and I learned the faces of the night shift. Miss Diaz with the floral scrubs who hummed under her breath. Omar who called everyone friend in a voice like warm tea. A physical therapist named Bree who coaxed me into standing and celebrated the inches like miles. I learned how pain rewrites your calendar. Morning was when the shoulder throbbed. Afternoon brought the startling knife under the ribs. Night was a fog of shallow breaths and bad dreams. I learned how to measure progress in mundane victories. The first time I brushed my teeth by myself, the first time I combed through the tangles, the first time I sat without feeling like a shipwreck. But most importantly, Thomas didn't come. The absence sat heavier than the cast. The first day, I told myself he didn't know. The second day, that he was stuck somewhere, that his phone died, that anyone can miss a call. After a week, excuses curdled into questions I was afraid to say out loud. When I could finally keep my eyes open for longer than a minute, I asked for my phone. The screen was a mosaic of missed messages from the lawyer, my mother, a few colleagues who had heard. Nothing from Thomas. I called. Straight to voicemail. I left a message with a voice that sounded too soft to be mine. It's me. I'm okay. I mean, I will be. Please call. I texted, then texted again. Where are you? I need you. Please. I opened WhatsApp and watched the little gray check marks sit there like gravestones. I told myself he was rehearsing, or the app was glitching, or the storm had knocked out a tower somewhere between us. But I told myself to stop telling myself things. At night, when the ward quieted and the monitors ticked in conversation, I opened our shared photos and scrolled with my good hand. There we were, dodging pigeons in a park. There he was, hunched over a drum kit with a focus that used to move me. There I was, holding a cheap cupcake with a crooked candle because he'd promised to make dinner and burned the pasta. I searched the pictures for a clue I couldn't name. I looked for what I'd missed. A couple of weeks passed in small circles. The therapist added steps to the hallway. The nurse changed my dressings and told me scars were stories, not verdicts. The lawyer left another message to discuss documents I didn't have the energy to consider. One afternoon, after a rough session, I asked Ms. Diaz if anyone had been by for me. The question sounded childish even as I said it. She looked at the chart, then at me, then at the door, as if weighing kindness against policy. That evening, while she adjusted my she leaned close enough that I could smell her peppermint gum. Her voice was a whisper meant to be caught and kept. Your husband came once, she said, eyes flicking toward the hall. But he was with another woman. She straightened the blanket before I could answer. Rest now, she added in her normal tone, as if the sentence hadn't just tilted the room. I lay there, watching the grid of lights blur into a wet constellation, and tried to rearrange what I knew. Rehearsing. No calls. Gray check marks. The truck that didn't honk. The key box exploding like a firework. A woman by his side. Suspicion arrived not with drama, but with a thin metallic taste, the way blood lingers after you bite your lip. The truth arrived in crooked pieces, like junk mail I kept trying to throw away. First, the silence. Then my phone, finally in my hand, and the sickening realization that his number went straight to voicemail because he'd blocked me. I tried our few mutuals from the old band days. One sent a heart emoji and wrote, I'm so sorry for your loss. Loss? I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I called back. He didn't answer. The hospital social worker suggested practical steps. Call your bank. Make sure bills are covered while you recover. I dialed from the bed, my wrist in its brace, my voice trying to sound like a person who had her life. The woman at the bank kept using calm phrases that scratched like sandpaper. I'm seeing the joint account was closed 2 weeks ago by the surviving spouse. I said I was the surviving spouse. She paused. Ma'am, Our records reflect a death notification on your profile. I laughed, a small raw sound I didn't recognize. I'm calling you, I said, as if that were proof of life. She gave me a number for the fraud department and warned me they'd need documentation. Documentation to prove I wasn't dead. I called our landlord next because I couldn't stop imagining my plant drooping in the kitchen window. He cleared his throat. Thomas turned in the keys. Said, "You know." I didn't know. He said Thomas had hired movers. Took the drums, the couch, your clothes too, most of them. Left a box of dishes and some books. He sounded defensive, then embarrassed. He paid last month and said the unit would be empty by the 1st. I thanked him because the alternative was screaming. The lawyer, Mr. Calhoun, the one who had read Uncle Leon's will, had been leaving messages. I finally picked up from my hospital bed late on a Thursday when the floor smelled like sanitizer and overcooked carrots. His voice was careful. "Ashley, I'm glad you're awake." He asked gently if I was alone. I said yes. He sighed. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news on the estate side. Thomas approached our office the week after your accident. He presented himself as your legal heir." The room tilted. My what? He explained that as my spouse, he believed he was entitled to administer, to manage, to access. He said it the way lawyers say things, neutral, precise, almost sterile. But the meaning set fire to my veins. "I'm not dead," I stated. "I know," he answered. It appears he told several parties otherwise. He listed them. The bank, the landlord, a supplier for the wineries who had called about a transition, even a delivery service that had been forwarding my packages to a new address. Mr. Calhoun sounded steady, but I heard the steel under it. "We did not and will not recognize any claim in your absence. But I need you to understand, he has already moved quickly." I opened my messages and went looking for a reality that matched mine. Friends I hadn't heard from in months sent candle emojis and paragraphs about heaven. An old neighbor wrote, "Thomas spoke so beautifully about you at the memorial." Memorial? Where? When? My body felt far away from itself, heavy and present, but my mind sprinted down hallways I didn't recognize. I tried to imagine the words he used, the lies he chose. I tried not to imagine him convincing them. By then I knew the other woman's name, Stephanie. A nurse on the night shift had mentioned it in the tone people use for bad weather. He said Stephanie needed to sit, she'd murmured. I typed the name into Facebook with the clumsy stubbornness of my braced hand. There are so many Stephanies. But there she was, a face half pouting at the camera in a bathroom selfie, the kind of winged eyeliner that takes patience. I clicked. Recent photos were locked down, but one public album had a picture of a wine bar I recognized, deep wood and dim light, and bottles lined like soldiers. The caption read, "A new chapter," with clinking glasses. I backed out and went to Thomas's page, where I'd stopped looking for months to avoid the ache. My stomach knew before my eyes did. His profile photo had changed to a shot of a ring on someone's hand, hers, from the looks of the almond-shaped nails. The cover image was that same wine bar. And there it was, a post from 2 days earlier. He was grinning, that familiar fox grin, in a suit that didn't fit quite right. Stephanie leaned into him in white, straps slung off one shoulder, a blush that looked like victory. The caption punched me square in the chest, "A new life begins." I stared at those 4 words until the room fuzzed and the machines near my bed heard my breath trip. "Are you okay?" the nurse asked, and I nodded because how do you answer that question when your husband has buried you alive online and married someone else at a place you could smell by memory? I wanted to throw the phone across the room. I wanted to call him so many times his screen filled with my name like a haunting. Instead, I zoomed in like a reporter. Behind them, a chalkboard listed the specials, a cab from Sonoma, a rose on tap, a flight named after constellations. I recognized the bartender, a guy who poured heavy and remembered birthdays. I took a screenshot and sent it to myself, then to Mr. Calhoun with a single line. "Is this enough proof of what he's saying?" He replied within minutes, even though it was late. "It corroborates his public claim. We'll preserve it." I kept scrolling, past comments from people I knew and people I didn't. "So happy for you. She's an angel. You deserve joy after all you've been through." After all he'd been through. The audacity of those words landed like a slap. A woman from the music scene wrote, "She brought him back to life." Someone else wrote, "Ashley would have wanted this." I put the phone down and pressed my hand over my ribs where the seatbelt had bruised me deepest. I tried to breathe through the pressure. I tried to remember the shape of my own wanting. The next day, Mr. Calhoun visited the hospital. He wore the same navy suit and carried a thin folder. He spoke to me like I was upright. He outlined what would happen next with the estate, holds, notices, the formal steps to counter any filings Thomas had attempted. "He cannot claim what is yours while you live," he said. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they skittered across the surface of my fear like pebbles. When he left, I asked the nurse to dim the lights. In the dark, the truth arranged itself into sentences I could not unknow. He told people I died, closed our account, emptied our home, and pledged himself to someone else in a wine bar while I lay dreaming under hospital lights. "A new life begins," he'd written. But whose? A month later, the door to my room opened without the soft knock the nurses used. I was in the chair by the window, the kind with a seatbelt strap so I wouldn't fall if my ribs protested. Physical therapy had left me shaky and chalk pale. My left wrist was still in a brace, my shoulder taped in a lattice under the hospital gown. The TV muttered low, showing a weather map I wasn't watching. The tray table held a paper cup of ice chips and the notebook where I wrote down every small thing I wanted to remember. Thomas walked in wearing a new suit, navy with that stiff factory sheen, and a tie I had never seen before. He was holding Stephanie by the hand like they were late for a reservation. He stopped in the doorway, surprised into stillness, his face doing a quick set of calculations I could almost hear. Stephanie's perfume reached me a second before her eyes did. I didn't stand. I couldn't have if I tried. I just watched them the way a person watches an approaching storm, already cataloging the colors. There were fresh scuff marks on his dress shoes. His hair was trimmed, the messy drummer curls disciplined into something corporate. On his left hand, the gold band caught the fluorescent light and threw it back at me like an insult. I recognized the makeup on Stephanie's collarbone, the pink that photographs well. She had on white again. Her gaze slid over the bed, the beeping machines, the walker folded like a metal insect in the corner, and landed on my face. For a heartbeat we stared at each other, strangers meeting in a place where strangers don't belong. Then Stephanie's mouth opened, sound following like a glass shattering in a tiled room. "Wait, but she should be dead." The nurse at the desk poked her head in, startled, then retreated the way people do when they sense something private wearing the clothes of public drama. The hallway fell quiet in that long stretchy way hospitals do when everyone is listening. Thomas said my name like a question he'd gotten wrong on a test. His lips formed it, but the word seemed to die before it cleared his teeth. He let go of Stephanie's hand. She clutched her purse to her stomach, as if I might take something from her just by breathing. Neither of them stepped forward. In that silence, my mind moved faster than my body could. The suit, the ring, the new tie, the timing, the Facebook post at the wine bar, the caption that had punched my ribs from the inside. I had spent a month trying to be reasonable about unreasonable things. Now reason arranged itself into an answer that made my skin go cold. He hadn't come to see me. He'd come to confirm the lie. I saw it in the color draining from his face, not grief, not relief, but the brief naked terror of a plan meeting the one variable it didn't control. It was there in the way his eyes flicked, not to my injuries, not to the foreline, but to the monitor that displayed my name and birth date, as if proof of my aliveness might be argued. He took a half step into the room, then stopped when the chair squeaked under my shift of weight. We were 3 people arranged around a fact that would not move. My mouth was dry. I swallowed and tasted metal and the last of the lemon ice. I could smell his cologne, something expensive that didn't suit him, and underneath it, the faint chemical clean of new clothes. Stephanie pressed closer to the doorframe, eyes wide as if I might stand up and chase her down the hall. For a second, a ridiculous second, I worried that she might faint and hit her head on the corner of the Sharps container. That old reflex, to care for the person who would not care for me, flickered and went out. Through the glass of the door, I could see the nurses moving in their slow, competent rhythm, wheels rolling, charts trading hands. Inside the room, nothing moved but the green numbers on the monitor and the slow drip in the 4-bag. I could hear the clock. The second hand sounded like a foot tapping. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask how. I looked at Thomas until he looked away. The part of me that had once written his name next to mine on napkins understood that whatever we'd been was over long before the bridge. "Please leave," I said, my voice low and even, and for the first time since the river took the car and the world spun black. Mr. Calhoun came back with a folder thick enough to change the air in the room. He set it on the rolling table the way surgeons set instruments, and asked if I was ready. I nodded because I had run out of ways to pretend nothing was happening. He clicked open the clasp and began to show me, one page at a time. The lawyer presented evidence. A certified copy of a death certificate filed in my parish 3 days after the crash, my name spelled correctly, my birthday correct, the date of death stamped in heavy ink. Only the signature of the coroner wasn't the coroner's, and the license number belonged to a retired physician in another county. The notary seal was from a mobile service that had been reprimanded twice for sloppy records. A handwritten line read, "Spouse notified," with Thomas's full name and a script I recognized from post-it notes left on our fridge. He had married a new story of me to a piece of paper that could unlock bank accounts and close doors. There was more. An affidavit filed in Orleans Civil District Court listed Stephanie Grace, legal sister, requesting notice of any probate actions regarding Leon's estate in the event the decedent's spouse is unable to administer. I stared at the neat type and felt heat rise to my face. Stephanie had signed in blue ink, a heart dotting the I in her last name. The notary on that document was the same mobile seal. The witness was a man who, according to Calhoun's investigator, had once worked as a barback at the very wine bar where they posted "A New Life Begins." How? I asked, which was not the right legal question, but the only human one I had. Easily, Mr. Calhoun said, not unkindly. When the right people are asleep at the switch, and the wrong people push hard. Calhoun had hired a private investigator the moment Thomas visited his office. The PI, Broussard, a woman with a buzz cut and a voice like gravel, sat in on the meeting and took notes while I traced the creases of my blanket. She slid photos across the tray. Thomas at the parish clerk's office, face turned just enough to show the profile I knew better than my own. Thomas and Stephanie meeting a notary in a supermarket cafe. Thomas searching his phone at the DMV. She had pulled camera stills, receipts, and logs that painted a picture of a man sprinting through bureaucracy. But the worst part wasn't the forged papers. The worst part was what the investigation revealed about the days leading to the crash. A hospital toxicology report, quietly requested by Calhoun through proper channels, noted that upon admission my blood carried traces of a strong sedative outside what the EMTs reported administering. It wasn't recreational, it was pharmaceutical and heavy. A follow-up hair analysis, Broussard said this gently, as if lowering a sharp thing to the floor, showed exposure roughly a week before the accident. A single significant ingestion, she said, consistent with a drink spiked at home. I heard my own voice from that week replay in my head, faint and echoing. I had come home late from a city meeting, hungry and wired, and Thomas had poured me a glass of white. It was a bottle from Leon's cellar I'd brought back against my better frugal sense, telling myself it was time to celebrate something. I remembered the first swallow tasting slightly chalky, like the glass had been washed in a new soap. I remembered sitting on the couch and feeling a wave lift the room sideways. I remembered saying, out loud, "I feel strange," and Thomas answering from the kitchen, "You're exhausted." I remembered pushing the glass away and getting up too fast, the world a smear, and going to our tiny bedroom to lie down. The neighbors filled in what I couldn't. Broussard had knocked on doors and asked quiet questions. Mrs. Hanley and 2B told her she heard us arguing that night through the old vent shafts. She heard my voice, thin and irritated, say, "I feel strange," and his say, "Stop being dramatic." Mr. Coe down the hall said he saw Thomas taking out trash at 1 in the morning, carrying the recycling directly to his car trunk instead of the bins, and thought, odd, because Thomas always forgot recycling day. The super said he found broken glass wrapped perfectly in a grocery bag at the bottom of the dumpster the next morning, as if someone had been careful not to spill any. Broussard was pretty serious. She listed facts like she was laying out cutlery. Your phone's location data shows you didn't leave the apartment again that night. His shows a drive around the block at 1:18 a.m. and a stop behind the strip mall for 7 minutes. He texted someone named CS at 1:23 a.m. and deleted the thread. We pulled a partial from the backup, an address for a liquor store, and the words same as last time. She met my eyes. We're still working on last time. They also obtained dispatch records from the trucking company whose vehicle hit me on the bridge. The driver's statement, recorded by state police, said he swerved to avoid debris that he later could not describe. His dash cam should have shown the approach, but the memory card was missing. The company had been struggling, one of their trucks recently repossessed. Their insurance policy was up for renewal. On the day before the crash, a call lasting 42 seconds pinged a tower near our apartment from the company's main number. My phone didn't receive it. Thomas's did. It's circumstantial, Broussard said, anticipating my leap. But it is a lot of circumstance. In the pile was an email thread with a life insurance agent. Thomas had inquired about the beneficiary payout for a policy we'd barely kept current. The agent responded that because the death certificate had not passed the full verification process, no money could be released. His reply, understood. How long does that take? The timestamp was 4 days post-crash. The subject line was next steps. I felt something crackle inside me, not a break but a current waking up. I thought of the promise he had made to me in offices and kitchens, the vows we had written in blue ink on a courthouse form. And then I thought about sedatives in wine and a piece of paper that declared me gone and a woman who doted an eye with a heart while claiming to be my sister. As for Stephanie, Broussard found she had, at minimum, played along. There was a clerk's stamp on the affidavit, a copy of her driver's license attached, a notary book entry with her signature. She had accompanied Thomas to 2 appointments, and when asked by a clerk how she was related to me, she'd said half-sister. She'd also posted, the afternoon they visited the parish office, a selfie in the car titled Paperwork Day, with a winking emoji that made my stomach flip. Whether she knew the full plan or just enough to feel clever, I didn't yet know. But her name sat beside mine in a place it did not belong. Calhoun cautioned me about patience. He spoke about filings and injunctions and notifying the DA. He said words like fraud, forgery, and attempt. He explained how the estate could be frozen until my identity, not the core of me, but the admin layer of my life, was fully reestablished. He told me to keep breathing and keep any notes. He told me the river of paperwork could be forced to change course. At night, the hospital went quiet except for the periodic murmur of wheels and the elevator's sigh. I turned the pages of the folder in my lap and tried to anchor myself to details. The wrong serif in the forged signature, the slant of Thomas's hand on a form, the timestamps lining up like footprints. The more I looked, the less it felt like a sudden storm, and the more it felt like a season he had been planting for a while. Slow moves, small deceptions, tests of how asleep the world was around us. The next morning, Broussard returned with a single new page. It was a screenshot of a text Thomas had sent a week before the crash to a contact saved as R. The message read, "She's woozy. Didn't finish. Need a cleaner chance." The timestamp hit me harder than any X-ray. In the text I could hear our living room, the chalky whine, the way I had said, "I feel strange," and wanted him to say, "We're going to the ER." Everything pointed to Thomas wanting to see the job through to the end. So I moved into Uncle Leon's mansion in Louisiana with 2 suitcases, a folder of medical instructions, and a stubborn hope that the house would know what to do with me. The place sat back from the road behind a pair of iron gates shaped like grapevines, their paint flaking in thin curls. Live oaks draped the driveway in shade, and the porch wrapped around the house like an arm. Inside, it was all echoes at first, long hallways, a stair that complained on the 3rd step, a scent of old paper and cork trapped in the molding. The mansion had stories etched into the wainscoting, but the plumbing wheezed and the roof sighed when it rained. I slept downstairs because the stairs felt like a mountain, the bell from my walker bumping time against the floorboards. The house was old, but after renovations, it became a refuge room by room, like laying down planks over water. I kept Leon's study intact, maps, the leather chair that groaned, the compass on its stand, but I let contractors into the guts. New wiring, a real alarm system, ducts that didn't cough, windows that finally shut. Ms. Pearl recommended a carpenter who respected things that lasted. He spoke softly to the banister and refused to oversand the handrail where generations had smoothed it. We patched the tin roof, reglazed the clawfoot tub, and installed grab bars that didn't look like a hospital. I bought lamps that threw warm circles on the floor at dusk. The first night the AC ran without stuttering, I stood in the hallway and cried, not from pain, but from relief. There, I began to recover. Mornings were for physical therapy, careful stretches at the end of the long hallway, heel-to-toe walks beside the baseboards, breathing exercises under the slow fans. Bree, my therapist, came twice a week and called me tough as sugarcane, which made me laugh because I didn't feel tough. I felt like a wet notebook drying in the sun. I learned how to lift a kettle again and how to reach for the top shelf without seeing stars. When my ribs complained, I sat on the porch steps and watched the light move across the yard like a second hand. Progress was measured in quiet victories no one would ever clap for. Afternoons belonged to the garden. Leon had let the back acre go wild in his last months, and I loved it that way at first. Flowers seeding where they pleased, vines negotiating fences, but the beds needed structure I could lean into. With Ms. Pearl's nephew's help, I set up cedar boxes near the kitchen door, tomatoes, okra, 3 kinds of basil because I could, and a stubborn row of zinnias for cheer. I tied twine to trellises with my good wrist and learned the rhythm of watering before heat took the day. Dirt under my nails became proof that I was still here. I left the old vines along the south wall and cut back the dead cane gently, like hair. The first time I carried in a bowl of warm cherry tomatoes, I placed them on the counter and whispered, "We did it," to an empty room. When the sun pushed me indoors, I set up a corner of the dining room for a project I'd kept whispering about for years. I created my own journalism forum, a place for women like me who'd spent too long writing between shifts, caring for everyone else's crises while ignoring our own. I named it Porchlight Press because I wanted it to feel like coming home. I dragged an old farm table beneath the chandelier and lined it with second-hand laptops I scrubbed clean. Then I set up a cheap ring light in the map room for live chats. Once a week we hosted roundtables, trauma reporting without losing yourself, telling the truth in small-town papers, how to pitch when your hands still shake. Members logged in from Baton Rouge, Tulsa, and a kitchen in Maine where the Wi-Fi cut out whenever it rained. We posted calls for pitches, swapped edits, mailed each other coffee we couldn't find locally. It was small and earnest and messy, and it made my days feel useful again. But one day, Stephanie contacted me. It was a text first, just my name and a number from an area code I recognized and didn't. I didn't answer. 2 days later, a voicemail. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, the edges sanded down. "I need to talk to you." I didn't know. I swear I didn't know everything. I stared at the phone until the screen went black and then lit again. Finally, I suggested a public place, a cafe near the courthouse where the coffee was bad and the ceiling fans were always on high. She arrived in sunglasses and a denim jacket that didn't fit the weather, hands white around a paper cup. Up close, the bridal gloss was gone. She apologized for screaming in my room. She said she had repeated the story Thomas told her until she could say it without choking, that I had died quickly and he had handled everything with grit. He said the paperwork was estate stuff, that the sister thing was a quirk that smoothed probate, that it was normal to sign for family. He said the death certificate was delayed because of state backlog. She believed him because she wanted to. He said you were cold, she admitted, not meeting my eyes. He said your marriage was over for years. And I didn't check. That's on me. I asked one question, did you know about the wine? She flinched and shook her head hard enough that a bobby pin slid down to her shoulder. No. God, no. She pressed her hands flat to the table as if bracing for a wave. I saw messages later. He asked someone for something to help her sleep. He told me it was for you after the funeral, when you were winding down. I didn't connect it. She scrolled through her phone and slid it across the table. Threads, timestamps, a blurred selfie in a car captioned "Paperwork Day," which made her cover her face. I thought we were building a life, she said. Turns out I was his proof. In the end, she testified against him. She sat in a room with the investigator and later with the DA, voice trembling at first, then steadying as facts lined up. She handed over texts, the selfie at the parish office, the note he'd written with the address of the notary, and the phrase "half-sis equals faster." She explained under oath how he'd told her I wanted my sister included so the money stayed in the family, how he'd turned legal jargon into lullabies. She cried when the prosecutor asked about our meeting in the hospital and admitted that fear, not grief, made her scream. It helped connect timelines I couldn't. We didn't become friends. We didn't trade recipes or forgiveness. But when I watched her walk out of the courthouse, jacket too thin for the wind, I felt something like gratitude settle beside the ache. Her words helped put Thomas behind bars. And that was enough. I drove home along River Road with the windows cracked, the live oaks leaning in like elders, and for the first time in months, the house came into view and looked less like a witness and more like shelter. The mansion kept meeting me where I was. I fixed what I could and let the rest take its time. Some evenings I found myself in Leon's study with the lamp on low, running my finger along the Mississippi on a faded chart until my shoulder loosened. When the trial finally ended and the sentence was announced, I felt an odd mixture of relief and emptiness. Thomas was given 10 years for fraud and attempted murder. 10 years sounded long on paper, but in my heart, I knew no number could truly measure the damage he had caused. Still, hearing the judge's gavel hit the desk gave me the first real breath of freedom I had taken in years. For weeks afterward, I would wake up in the mansion, open the tall shutters to let in the Louisiana morning light, and whisper to myself, "He can't hurt me anymore." It became my private ritual, my way of reminding myself that I had survived, that the chains he had wrapped around my life were broken. The money my uncle left me could have been a golden cage, but I chose to turn it into something more. I made the decision to donate most of the inheritance to shelters and organizations for women who, like me, had faced brutal betrayal, violence, and humiliation at the hands of those they once trusted. Writing those checks, visiting the shelters, listening to stories of women who had lost everything yet still found the strength to stand, I felt as though Uncle Leon's fortune was being transformed into something pure, something healing. He always told me I was the one person who didn't pretend for money, and I wanted to honor that truth. Some people questioned me, why give away so much? Why not keep it all for yourself? But the answer was simple. I had lived through the darkest nightmare and walked out alive. The real treasure wasn't in the millions, it was in having a second chance. No bank account could compete with the peace I felt when I walked through those shelter doors and saw women holding their heads a little higher because someone believed in them. And yet, the past never disappears completely. Sometimes I caught myself scrolling through old photos, Thomas on stage in Austin, holding his drumsticks high, Thomas asleep on our couch after a gig, his hand still smelling of cigarettes, Thomas laughing, promising me a future full of music and love. Those memories hurt because they reminded me that once upon a time, I had believed in him with everything I had. But betrayal has a way of erasing the good, painting over it with a stain that never quite washes out. I also thought often of Stephanie. She had been deceived just like me, woven into his lies until the truth nearly broke her apart. Though we never became friends, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. She was another victim of his hunger for money, another woman who had believed his promises. The day she testified against him, her voice shaking but firm, I realized we were bound together by something none of us had asked for, the scars left by the same man. Living in Uncle Leon's mansion, I sometimes walked through the old study where he kept his antique maps. I would run my fingers over the yellowed edges and wonder if he had known how much I would need this place. The mansion became my sanctuary, a reminder that family could be more than blood ties. It could be about faith, dignity, and legacy. His house gave me safety when my own husband had tried to take everything away. And now I sit in the garden, listening to the cicadas hum as the sun sets over the grapevines. I feel a deep sense of calm. Thomas took 10 years of his life from himself, and I reclaimed the rest of mine. To anyone watching or listening this, I want to ask you, have you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted the most? Write in the comments below. I would love to hear your own story, because sharing is how we remind each other that we are not alone. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Your voice could be exactly what someone else needs to hear to finally say, I've had enough.